they have sent a message, and that message is our response was weak. So please do something like this again, escalate further, because your escalation isn't going to be punished. What we've seen constantly is Russia escalating and the West refusing to either meet that escalation or to escalate on its own. And I think this has been a history of Russian bad behavior not being punished, and the Russians understanding that they can keep pushing, pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. We could, for example, declare an air defense identification zone within Ukraine. We could say, hey, along the Ukrainian border, 150 kilometers into Ukraine, we're going to treat any Russian munition that enters this as a potential threat to NATO, and we're going to shoot it down. There are many things that we could do, many practical things that we could do, but there just needs to be political will to do it. And at the moment, unfortunately, that doesn't exist.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we are speaking to foreign policy and security expert Jimmy Rushton, who is joining us from in front of a BTR-70 armoured personnel carrier, or rather what is left of one. We are here in Kyiv itself. Jimmy, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, recently you've been at the front with Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade. I wonder if we could start with what you've seen there and what they are doing at the moment.
So yeah, I spent a week and a half with 3rd Assault Brigade in the east of Ukraine. Obviously they're fighting and they're holding back the Russians in the face of determined Russian offensive pressure. They have just been upgraded to a corps, an army corps. They're now 3rd Army Corps, and they're bringing in a number of other brigades into their core structure. Essentially, the benefit of this is that instead of having multiple different brigades fighting along one section of the front, you now have one Army Corps, which has all of these brigades under its own unified command structure, which means that both offensive and defensive actions can be far more effective. You have far greater levels of coordination and cooperation. And yeah, you have a combined command and control system that will inherently make the same number of troops fight far more effectively. We're already seeing results of this. I spoke to some figures in 3rd Assault, and they told me that casualties on their side are down, casualties on the Russian side are up, and that they're holding fast in their section of the front. The Russians are not making any progress, despite the fact that they brought in one of the best drone units on the Russian side, Rubicon, which is directly under the Russian Ministry of Defense. They have essentially unlimited funding, unlimited operational freedom. And still, they're not able to make any advances in 3rd Army Corps' section of the front line. So I think moving forward, you'll see other parts of the Ukrainian military follow this example. There are already other parts of the Ukrainian military that are moving to a core system. And yeah, I think it will be a far more effective way of organising the military than the previous brigade-based system.
And how much is that change to the core structure creating a model for the Ukrainian military to move further towards Western and NATO-style military structure, strategy and tactics as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the big problems with the Ukrainian military still, unfortunately, is the legacy of the Soviet military system. You see this, unfortunately, still in a lot of the training here, which is very Soviet. And in Ukraine, calling something Soviet is absolutely a pejorative. It's one of the worst insults that you can levy against something is that this is very Soviet. And essentially in 3rd Assault Brigade and in other brigades in the Ukrainian military, the better brigades in the Ukrainian military, they are moving towards a NATO standard, in command and control, in mission planning, using something that we would call mission tactics or mission command, which enables a far greater level of initiative for subordinates in a command chain. So instead of a kind of a very top-down command and control Soviet-style system, it's very much the NATO system, mission command is very much a system that empowers subordinates. So instead of telling them, say, you will go here, you will do this at this time, and you will approach an objective in this specific way. Under the Western system, a subordinate will be told what to do, why they need to do it, the commander's intent, and then they will be free to approach that objective the way they want to, and the way that makes most sense in this situation as it presents itself.
And how does the way the Ukrainians are adjusting and starting to fight this war compare to what the Russians were doing? And what did you see of Russian infantry units while you were at the front?
Well, you only really ever see the Russians through drone feeds. So I spent some time in one of their command centers, and we were watching the drone feeds. We were watching the feeds of the reconnaissance drones and the strike drones, and they have 24/7 observation both sides of the opponent. So whenever you're at the front line, all your movement is observed. And the Russians, they've been adapting significantly. So what you're seeing now is the Russians using a lot of small unit tactics. Instead of massing armor and massing infantry, they're using groups of 2, 3, 4, 5 infantry at a time. Often they use motorbikes or ATVs to approach the Ukrainian lines quickly, because essentially the most dangerous part of any assault is when they're trying to get to the Ukrainian positions. They want to get to the Ukrainian positions quickly. They want to get into the trench systems quickly, because at that point, Ukrainian artillery and Ukrainian drones are far less effective. It's the same for the Ukrainians as well. If the Ukrainians ever attempt to assault the Russian lines, what they attempt to do is to get into these trench systems as quickly as possible. That way you negate the enemy artillery, you negate the enemy drones to a large extent. So both sides are evolving. Both sides are, it's a constant battle between defensive tactics and offensive tactics. Unfortunately, from a Ukrainian perspective, the Russians are still advancing, and the Russian tactics are effective. They're effective despite the fact they're expending huge amounts of manpower in order to achieve these relatively marginal gains.
And how have Russia, what's the impact been on Russian units in trying to deal with these newer Ukrainian tactics on the front line?
So from the Russian perspective, it's very much dependent where you are, right? So, for example, with 3rd Assault Brigade, what Russia has done is they brought up one of their best drone units, which is Rubicon. The full name, Rubicon Center for Unmanned Technologies, which is probably the best drone unit in the entire war. It's directly under the Russian Ministry of Defense. It's not subordinated to anyone. It has essentially unlimited funding and complete operational freedom. And these are the guys that made the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk essentially untenable by destroying and cutting off the logistics routes into Shudra. So what you're seeing is in some places where the Russians are coming up against very determined resistance, like when they come up against 3rd Assault Brigade, for example, they're bringing their best units in and they're trying to compete quality with quality. In other sectors of the front, they're just using, mass amounts of infantry in these small unit, groups. And from the Ukrainian perspective, obviously they're still severely undermanned. They try to compensate for manpower with unmanned systems. Ukrainians use a lot of drones. Both sides use a lot of drones, but the Ukrainians are incredibly reliant on drones for their defense. And it's effective in a sense because they are essentially, the Russians are paying an astronomical price for relatively small gains. Mm-hmm. And what they can't do is they can't win the war making these tiny gains and expending thousands and thousands of men per square kilometre that they take.
Well, meanwhile, in NATO territory, we have seen Western strategy and tactics in action after Poland was hit with several Russian drones only a few days ago. Do you think the reaction of NATO was enough to send any sort of message to the Russians not to try something like this again?
I definitely think that they have sent a message, and that message is our response was weak. So please do something like this again, escalate further, because your escalation isn't going to be punished. What we've seen constantly is Russia escalating and the West refusing to either meet that escalation or to escalate on its own. And I think this has been a history of Russian bad behavior not being punished, and the Russians understanding that they can keep pushing, pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. It goes back to Crimea. They annexed Crimea. They didn't really get punished for it. So what did they do next? They invaded eastern Ukraine. They really didn't get punished for it. So what did they do next? And it keeps going on. And until Russia meets a solid pushback, they will keep escalating. I actually think that if Putin, his calculation in invading Ukraine didn't, well, firstly, it didn't expect Ukraine would resist in the way that it has, but it also didn't expect the West would support Ukraine in the way it has. So I think what you see is that it's actually more dangerous when you don't stand up to a country like Russia, because they maybe falsely assume that they can be more aggressive than they actually can be. I think if we'd have stood up to Russia in 2014, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now, almost certainly.
And yeah, the Netherlands and the Czech Republic said they're sending air defences to Poland. France is sending Rafale fighter jets. Lithuania as well, also with a border very close to Russia, will receive a brigade of German troops. I mean, will any of that send an effective message to the Kremlin, or at least be the basis for further European action, do you think?
I don't think so. So we've seen a Russian incursion into Poland, and what have we done? Instead of punishing Russia, we've just essentially increased our defensive posture in Poland. Okay, great. What does that say? It says we're going to be constantly reactive. We're always going to react to what Russia does rather than being proactive. We could, for example, declare an air defense identification zone within Ukraine. We could say, hey, along the Ukrainian border, 150 kilometers into Ukraine, we're going to treat any Russian munition that enters this as a potential threat to NATO, and we're going to shoot it down. Perfectly practical, justifiable considering the Russian actions, and feasible. There'd be no risk of escalation because Russian manned aircraft don't go that far into Ukraine. Russian manned aircraft don't go into Ukraine generally, or at least not the unoccupied areas of Ukraine, because they get shot down by Ukrainian air defense. So there are many things that we could do, many practical things that we could do, but there just needs to be political will to do it. And at the moment, unfortunately, that doesn't exist.
And there was effectively no response from President Trump. Obviously, a lot of quite shocking news coming out of the US this week. But should that lack of response from the US on this be almost more of a worry for European partners than the actual incursion by these drones itself?
Yeah, I think it's worrying. I think the problem with Trump is, he can say anything at one moment and then turn around and say something completely different the next. I think with the Americans and the Trump administration, it's always worth watching what they do rather than what he says. But for sure, if you're Poland, you're going to be very, very worried that your key ally, the United States, is essentially whitewashing the most serious incursion into Polish airspace since Poland became a free country again.
But it doesn't necessarily then imply that the US has stepped back or given up on the ideas that were being discussed of after the war is finished, there being possibly US air cover or US support for a European peace force in Ukraine.
I don't think so. And again, the problem that the Trump administration is so chaotic. I don't think anyone has any idea what they're actually thinking or what they're going to do from minute to minute. A week ago or a week and a half ago, the Polish president was in DC, and Trump was talking about increasing troop levels in Poland. So, which is it? Is this the US that's pulling back from Eastern Europe, or is this the US that's increasing troop levels in Poland? It's, again, their position changes from day to day, and it's very difficult to know if there's a coherent policy at all. I don't think there is a coherent policy in regards to Russia, unfortunately.
And you are based here in Kyiv, Jimmy. Do you think many here are taking the idea of European security guarantees or some sort of peace force particularly seriously at the moment, given that they can only come after a peace deal, which we don't seem to be any closer to getting than when it was first proposed by President Trump?
No, I don't. I think from the Ukrainian perspective, the best security guarantee is the Ukrainian military. That I think that kind of part of the reason why you're seeing these military reforms now is the Ukrainians realizing that unfortunately nobody is going to come in and save them. it's really a case of they're going to have to win this war by themselves, really, with some external aid, of course, in terms of armaments and funding, etc. But, you know, Russia is only going to be deterred in future by a Ukraine that, as Ursula von der Leyen said, resembles a steel porcupine that can defend itself against any potential Russian incursion, or at least make any future Russian incursion so costly that they don't want to try it again.
And you mention that spikiness that Ukraine is trying to create within its defensiveness. One of those new spines, if you will, has come in the form of the long-range missile, the FP5 or the Flamingo. The impact of Kyiv's long-range strikes is sometimes played down. We're now starting to see fuel prices going up at the pump in Russia. Is it something that the Kremlin will be paying attention to, at least, when they're calculating how much longer they can carry on this invasion?
Absolutely, they have to. And it's not just the Flamingo, it's the Ukrainian domestic drone program. It's a number of other systems. They have Long Neptune, which is a improved version of the Neptune anti-ship missile, which sunk the Moskva cruiser. You know, they have Storm Shadow cruise missiles, which borrowed of the UK and France. And all of these systems provide, you know, an offensive punch for Ukraine that Moscow has to reckon with. The other thing I think you should definitely remember is that Ukraine also has this incredible kind of guerrilla mentality when it comes to attacking Russia. So we saw in Operation Spiderweb, the SBU using FPV drones hidden in trucks. There's always the risk of something like this happening again because Ukrainians are incredibly proficient at operating inside Russia. Every Ukrainian can speak Russian, almost every Ukrainian can speak Russian. They can pass as a native Russian speaker relatively easily. Russians can't do that in Ukraine. Most Russians don't speak Ukrainian. Most Russians can't, they can't hit those cultural, touchstones that Ukrainians can. Because most Ukrainians were raised in a culture where Russian music, Russian literature, Russian television, films were dominant because of cultural repression. So from from a Ukrainian perspective, that's actually very advantageous to them if they're running operations inside Russia, because they can just pass as a native Russian. They can make all the cultural references that a Russian can. They can speak perfect Russian with a perfect Russian accent. And we've seen this multiple times with Ukrainian operations inside Russia.
And you, of course, have been at the front recently. How does life there compare to life back here in Kyiv?
So obviously it depends where you are. Lots of the sections of the front have been essentially completely depopulated. It's difficult to explain in regards to how, for example, how you used to do war reporting, right? You could go to the front, you could go to a trench, you could see the enemy, or you could see the enemy lines relatively easily. Even at the start of this war, you could do that. At this point, that's become so dangerous, you just can't do it anymore. The level of danger when you're, say, 10 to 15 kilometers away from what they call the grey zone, which is a zone which is not controlled by either side, is so astonishingly dangerous, both for civilians and for military, that area is generally depopulated. You still see some elderly Ukrainians that stay because they haven't got anywhere to go. But for your average civilian living in a city, village, town close to the front, it's astonishingly dangerous. In Kherson, for example, which is regional capital of Kherson Oblast in the south of Ukraine, the only thing that separates Ukrainian-controlled territory to Russian-controlled territory there is the Dnieper River. And Russia is using huge numbers of FPV drones, Mavic drones, dropper drones, to hunt civilians essentially for sport, for training, in an attempt to depopulate that city. And it's astonishing. It's astonishingly dangerous. And if you're a civilian living in one of these territories, it's incredibly difficult time.
And do you get a sense here in Kyiv that there is any end in sight yet for this conflict? Do people have any forward or future plans, or is there a general understanding that the Russians aren't planning on calling their offensive off at any point soon?
So it's interesting. When you speak to people here, you have to, you talk about, oh, what are your plans? It's like, well, I'd like to do this after the victory or after the end of the war. But it's almost like you're living in a sense of limbo, because people here have no idea how long it's going to last. They have no long idea, day to day, what's going to happen tomorrow. Is my house going to be destroyed by a missile tomorrow? Am I still going to have a job tomorrow? Is my place of work going to be destroyed by a missile tomorrow? So it's the level of insecurity, I think, is something that's really difficult to kind of get across. And that's even in Kyiv, right, where the air defense is relatively strong, and your chances of actually, getting hit by a missile or getting hit by debris is relatively low. But still, for Ukrainians, they're trying to work out what their future looks like. And that's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult to try and work out what your life looks like in a year's time. Because in a very real sense, nobody knows if Ukraine will exist in a year's time. I think it obviously will. I don't think Ukraine is going to surrender or be defeated. But still, that there's a very real possibility that, part of Ukraine might not be Ukraine anymore. That, it's it's difficult to describe, and if you haven't experienced it, it's difficult to comprehend, really, to that level of insecurity, that level of uncertainty that exists during war.
And on the world stage, where does that leave Russia? Because we talked about the impact this war is having on their economy because of the long-range strikes, as well as the losses in terms of just population and manpower. We even saw in China at the large ceremony that Putin attended, the Chinese turning down a new Russian oil deal. They act as if they can carry on with this war in eternity, but is that really true, do you think?
I'm not an economist, but I don't think you need to be an economist to look at the Russian economy and think this is not sustainable long term. You're seeing inflation very high, interest rates very high. You're seeing this distortion of the Russian economy where everything is being driven by the war. You're seeing areas of Russia where recruitment sign-on bonuses and death bonuses are basically driving the local economies. And this is creating massive distortions to the Russian economy. You're seeing unemployment being very, very low, but that's not a good thing, because they're not being able to find people to work in the armaments plants or the, in transportation infrastructure. I don't think it's sustainable long term. I think the problem is, although it isn't sustainable long term, it's sustainable in the short to medium term. So I think pressure needs to be increased on the Russian economy. I think we need to see more sanctions. We need to see more sanctions on the most productive parts of the Russian economy, which is the oil and gas industry. I think one good thing the Trump administration has done is they've reportedly been pressuring Hungary and Slovakia to remove their purchases and their dependence on Russian oil and gas, which is great. I mean, it's purely selfish from an American perspective, because they want them to buy American oil and gas instead. But still, it's a good step.
And so President Putin walks a sort of tighter line than he would perhaps like us in the West to think.
I think for the Russians, they still think that they can outlast Ukraine. They still think they can outlast Western support for Ukraine, but the Russian situation is not particularly rosy, neither on the battlefield nor in the economic sense or even the diplomatic sense. And there are signs that their isolation is slightly coming to an end. But okay, they're generally less isolated within the countries where Russia is traditionally strong. So you're seeing relatively good relationships with India. You're seeing relatively good relationships with China, DPRK, for example. But these are not the countries that, Russia really wants to have good relations with. Obviously, they want to have good relations with those countries, but what they want is to have the relationships that they had with Europe. They want to be able to sell oil and gas to Europe again. They made an absolute fortune selling gas to Europe. Gazprom was one of the most profitable companies in Russia, and now it's essentially going bankrupt. Selling gas to China, for example, just doesn't compare to selling gas to Europe in terms of profit. Even if you assume that they can build this proposed Siberian 2 pipeline before the end of the decade, which they probably can't, it's still going to be far more expensive just because it's a far longer route to take. And the Chinese are going to scalp them in terms of the price that they're willing to pay. The Indians are scalping them on the price of oil. They're buying it at a discount, they're selling it at a massive profit. So yeah, for the Russians, they want to be able to have a good relationship with the countries they traditionally had good relationships with. They want to be able to sell oil and gas to Europe. They can't do that at the moment. So they are still relatively isolated in that regard.
Well, Jimmy Rushton, foreign policy and security expert, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline. You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.